Hello, friends, and welcome to the Montessori mission. 10 Montessorians, 10 communities, 10 perspectives, 10 questions. And here with me today for episode 10, to the finale of our podcast series, I'm so delighted to welcome Sid Mohandas to the Montessori mission. Lots of you will know Sid already. He's a familiar face in the Montessori world. He is a former Montessori educator and teacher trainer, a guest lecturer at Middlesex University in the UK. He's the founder of the platforms, the Male Montessorian and Montistory, that I'll highly recommend you take a look at. And currently he's doing his doctorate at Middlesex University. So it is with great delight and it is a great honor to welcome Sid today to our finale for the Montessori mission. And his unique perspective on Montessori is just going to bring something so special for us all today. So Sid, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, Charlotte, for inviting me. Such amazing experience to meet you and to be part of this.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to have you. Thank you. So shall we dive into our questions? Or actually, before we dive into the questions, could you tell us a bit more about your doctorate at Middlesex University before we dive in? Because your story is really, really interesting of how you came to Montessori itself and your time in the classroom. Would you mind taking us back a few years and telling us how that all began, your path?
Yeah, absolutely. I was previously doing cell and molecular biology, master's in Sweden, and during that time I came across a friend who was a psychotherapist, and she actually was sharing how many of the things that adults go through as, during their adulthood have their roots in childhood. And that kind of got me thinking about my own childhood and my own, the struggles that I had as an adult. And it got me searching for different pedagogical approaches. And I came across Montessori as a result. And that's how my journey, in early childhood started off. So yeah, and it's been a number of years now, and currently, as you said, I'm doing a doctorate, and I'm exploring and investigating how a gendered workforce emerges in Montessori context by using post-human and new materialist theories, as well as putting them in conversation with postcolonial, decolonial, and some other subaltern theories. So it's been quite a journey.
Amazing. And tell us more about your doctorate. So when you say about Montessori in the gendered workplace, what does your work involve in the doctorate? What's the research that you're doing?
Right. So I mean, traditionally Montessori is framed often as gender neutral, and
yeah, very much so. We celebrate that, don't we?
That's right.
As being gender neutral, that's kind of our thing.
Yeah. So I trouble that idea that the classroom is gender neutral, and I try to, using these different theories, I try to bring in how every encounter we have is riddled with gendered relationalities, and the subtle sort of ways that gender emerges within everyday encounters. That's really what my doctorate is trying to unpack and unravel.
Incredible. And is that, and obviously there's the majority of guides are female, so does that play a big part, or is it more in the materials themselves are gendered? I mean, you haven't finished your doctorate, right? So you maybe don't know the answer yet, but what are you finding so far? It sounds really fascinating.
I think the dominant narrative is that we need more men. And my research kind of troubles that, in the sense that when we focus on this idea that we need more men to rescue early childhood, it kind of masks and obscures a lot of other aspects that are problematic aspects that are happening within the classroom in terms of sustaining patriarchy in other ways. And just simply having men in the classroom does not really address some of the gendered inequalities that we experience. And quite often men who come into the sector experience that sort of what you call the glass escalator, that is,
we've spoken about that before.
To climb up into leadership and management roles quickly, and that is problematic.
Very much so. So putting training lots more male guides isn't the answer then?
No, it's not. It's exposing everyone to gender-sensitive pedagogy and knowing how complexly gender emerges in the classroom, so we don't need simplistic narratives around gender. That just doesn't help.
Yeah, very true. I think simplistic narratives around anything, like, it's really the crazy past 2 years we've had of COVID actually have really shown that, haven't they? It's all intrinsically linked, even though we kind of knew it before, but it wasn't right in our face. And now we've been made to look at a lot of uncomfortable things right in our face, which is a good thing for us in the West, in privileged spaces. I think, so your doctorate sounds incredible, and I love, as you said, we don't just need more male guides. It's a lot more. There's a lot more. Thank you so much for the insight. Your doctorate sounds so fascinating. And when will you be finished? When are your final submissions? Quite soon, I believe. And when will it be published, do you think?
I've already published a number of papers and chapters, so some of my work is already available, in journals and in books. So, if anyone's interested, they're more than welcome to, access that. I'm happy to provide, the links.
Great.
And,
we'll put some links to that,
but my doctorate should finish April, hopefully, next year. Where I would submit my thesis and defend it.
Cool. Thanks so much. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. And so now I think we're ready to dive into the 10 questions, and I'm so interested to hear your perspective, particularly as you said before we started recording that you might say some controversial things. So I'm really hoping you're going to say some controversial things. Well, I suppose you've already said it with the male guide thing. So you've already had one controversial thing said. So it's brilliant. I think if we could get to 10, as many one for each question, that would be perfect. So Sid, thank you so much for joining me for episode 10. And the first question for the Montessori mission is, please, what does Montessori mean to you?
For me, Montessori is about responsiveness. Now, this may seem controversial, but to me, Montessori is not exclusively about the child, by which I mean it is not about viewing the child as an isolated entity, but instead seeing childhood as inextricably entangled in relations, and that too shifting relations. So it is about attuning to those situated contextual relations and engaging in practices of care. So even if we look into the history of the Montessori method, we realize that it emerged as a response to very specific political, economic, and social issues, and enormously shaped by Montessori's own political consciousness and her feminist activism. So I believe Montessori is a responsive pedagogy that is, it is, or at least should be, about responding to contemporary childhoods and contemporary issues, responding to situated sort of injustices, enacting care, and enabling creative capacities. So yeah, that's what Montessori means to me.
Oh, that's beautiful. And you touched on her feminist activism, and yeah, it's something that I think we're all revisiting, aren't we? I mean, so much of Montessori's work we're revisiting in different ways, with all the books being sort of republished and in recent years. And yeah, certainly I studied 10 years ago, and I hadn't really grasped at the time, the strong feminist activism. Obviously, she was one of the first female doctors, and there's that kind of obvious benchmark there. But then, so much of her work, when we look deeper, is really in that context, and it's really interesting. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. Thank you. So, question 2 is: what was your first light bulb moment on your Montessori path? The first light bulb moment.
Well, I don't know if it's the first one, but a very important light bulb moment for me. As a newly qualified teacher, I remember going through the phase of meticulously following the album for my presentations.
Yeah. Yeah, we've all done that, yeah.
So much so that I sometimes became oblivious to the children in front of me and their sort of worlds. That as I became more attuned, I realized that I could adapt the presentations based on where each child was at, without losing sight of its rationale. However, my view on presentations considerably changed when I was put in charge of a classroom of 38 children.
Wow, 38.
Yeah, and I realized that my role as the arbiter of the materials and learning was displaced, with the role often taken up by children in the classroom. And that's when I realized, children were absolutely capable and always already in modes of learning, whether I was overseeing their learning or not. Learning is constantly happening, and so that decentering of the adult in the classroom and seeing children's capacities and abilities to that unfold was definitely, a very critical light bulb moment for me.
That's so lovely. As you say, decentering of the adult, and then that magical time in the year when the older children are doing most of the presentations is just incredible. It's really something. It feels like, along all the other cores of Montessori, that's at the core of Montessori, when the children actually take over and run the classroom themselves, that's really what we are hoping to gift them. Or we have, as you said, decentered ourselves enough that they have the freedom and the confidence and the joy to lead others. My daughter's in the Montessori elementary here, and she's the youngest in the class. She's 6, and I see that more and more in her class, that she's just being guided so much by the other children, and other children are 7, 8, 9, and it's really incredible.
It's really magical to witness that sort of transformation that happens. The big stage classroom is just phenomenal.
Yeah, it should be standard, or sorry, not it should be. That's a horrible way of putting it. How can we make it standard for all educational methods? Yeah, that it's a mix. That's mixed stage. Yeah, that's the question, I guess, for us to ask, how we can bring Montessori in a wider way to mainstream education in a way that can serve more children, rather than just the Montessori children that we are serving. Yeah. And number 3 is going to be a tricky question, because Montessori, I guess, is your life, as you're doing a doctorate on it. But question number 3 is: in what ways does Montessori enrich the work that you do?
Montessori has definitely enlarged my capacity to care. and be cared for.
Oh, that's lovely. Enlarge my capacity to care. That's just so lovely.
I guess one of the things that really struck me when I first came to Montessori or came across her writings was the deep seated respect, trust, and reverence she had for the child. I grew up in a context and time when it was believed that children should be seen and not heard. So very often when it comes to education, you can hear the voices of parents, teachers, policymakers, and politicians, while the child is often the silent recipient of all things. Everything is done for and to them. Therefore, for me, the idea of granting the children freedom, voice, and agency touches the little child in me that wished to be heard and listened to. And this is great, I mean, this is what education should be. However, what is truly transformative is when that respect, trust, and care permeates all layers and tissues of the Montessori experience, especially teacher training programs and the teacher training experience. I believe my teacher training at the former MCI, particularly the foundation degree program that they had, was quite a remarkable and transformative experience for me. That is to experience that deep-seated respect, trust, and care from the tutors. It gives you something to hold on to, something tangible, especially for those of us who did not experience Montessori as children. How can we give that Montessori experience if that isn't embedded in the sort of adult Montessori teacher training experience or teacher preparation experience? But sadly, I've come to realize that this is not the norm. That, what I experienced wasn't the norm. The dominant approach to training and preparation of the adult in Montessori continues to be disconnected from the philosophy that drives our practice with children. So students are treated as blank slates, and the assessment approaches and frameworks are very top down, and student agency is just quite limited. So I really think that the Montessori experience, there needs to be a seamless practice of the philosophy across the boundaries, across, it's not just a childhood experience, but it needs to permeate all different aspects of the Montessori community. So yeah, I mean, Montessori has really opened up possibilities to care and be cared for. So that sort of reciprocity and
yeah, that's really beautiful. I love how you put that. As you say, we can't offer this respect and care and reverence to children and not actually offer it to the adults we're interacting with as well. The parents that we're interacting with, families that we're working with, we all have our own, as you said, inner child that we need to tend to, and because it's so hard being a parent, and particularly your first child when you don't really know what's going on, we have to tend to that parent's inner child when we're talking about their child in front of us.
Absolutely. And as well as staff. I mean, I often think, there was this place that I worked at, phenomenal Montessori school, perfect, great practice with the children and, all of that. But there was this sort of, because it was a pack away Montessori setting, we had to come early and set up the classroom. And during this process, you had the leadership and manager running around shouting at the staff, and as soon as the children came in, everyone had to be calm. So
Zen,
that strong dualism that was going on. How can you talk about caring and loving and being respectful to children when you're not being that way with adults. And we really need to address that within the Montessori community, because it is a problem.
Definitely, that lack of congruency in following our practice all the way through, but it being a way of life, not just, as you say, we turn on at 8 a.m. and then turn off again at 2 p.m. or what have you. When I was in Cape Town in my classroom, I don't know if you're familiar with the Imago Dialogue, and I did the Imago Dialogue, which is a really incredible way of communicating to ensure that everyone is heard in a conversation, and that's it's a form of therapy as well called Imago therapy, and it's ensuring that everyone's heard so that they can have their needs met if everyone's truly heard. And because in South Africa the racial structure is so complex, and working in the classroom, naturally there would be a white lead, and then the classroom assistants and all the other staff would be non-white. Then in order to really have equal conversations, it wasn't possible to have an equal conversation. So the Imago Dialogue, and it was the principal of the school who introduced me to it, and that was really a way of trying to draw out from everyone in the room, what really their needs were in a situation where it wouldn't have been accepted or appropriate for everyone of color to say what their needs were. And I completely agree with every single person we come in contact with, and particularly the people who are working the longest hours and the people who are being paid the least are the people who most need to be heard.
Absolutely. So true.
Thank you. It's great, really great reflection. Thank you. So question 4 is a really, one of my favorites actually. So when was the first time a child taught you something about yourself that you weren't aware of? And either a direct interaction or something that you observed that sort of triggered you, or whatever the scenario was, the first time.
Not so much about myself, but more so about life.
Okay, yeah.
And definitely not the first time, but I was reminded of this encounter recently when we were preparing for the technology summit with Montessori Europe.
Yeah.
At one of the preschools that I worked at, cameras were incorporated as part of the daily life of the classroom, where it was used as a sort of valid mode of meaning making, which involved children taking photos and some form of photo elicitation taking place, where you take the photo back and children, kind of explain and have a dialogue with children around the photos. So one time I was going through the photos in the school camera, and I came across these blurred images of a raised platform in the garden area. I knew who had taken these photos, so I took it back to the child, and they shared that the raised platform was a spot that they would go and sit when they felt really sad and when they missed their mom. It was also the platform that they went and sat, when they were waiting expectantly for their parents to come back. So that really touched me, and it underscored the fact that the children are constantly making sense of their world and actively, making connections and meanings, whether we know it or not. And it gave me a new appreciation for indeterminacy and being okay with not knowing. It really helped me to move away from thinking that the child can be fully known or fully figured out. So that really, it taught me that it's okay and valuable to not know. And I think Montessori herself talks about this think it's creative development in the child, where she talks about how it's whilst it's beautiful to witness children's learning, it's what's happening within the child isn't for us to know. And then she says the secret of childhood belongs to the child, which I think is fabulous. That sort of place of not knowing is a good place to be. So that's something I learned from my encounter there.
Yeah. Oh, that's lovely. And how old was the child who'd taken the photo?
Possibly 3.
3. Oh, wow. Yeah. Lovely. Yes, the us not having to know everything what's going on in our child's mind is actually a good thing. There's that great quote about the child without a secret. Children need to have secrets. They need to have their inner world to themselves that we're not prying into. And I guess in modern Western society, that's the opposite. We're trying to schedule them and make sure that every single bit of time, and their education is accounted for, and we've kind of covered every single base, moving away from sort of more in my childhood, my early years were very wild in terms of just going into the garden for like hours and playing in the fields and what have you, and just doing probably all types of dangerous things my parents didn't really know what we were getting up to. And in one generation we've really lost that.
That space to be has kind of been lost.
Really, very much so. I'm lucky enough here that we live in a small apartment, but there's a park right opposite us, like sort of just 4 or 5 meters across the way. So I let the children go out, and they're confident enough to go out and just play in the park on their own, and so I can kind of clean the house and cook and what have you. And it's so great, and they come back really, really grubby and like famished and thirsty and all this stuff, and like scrape knees and stuff and climbing trees. And it just always makes me think, wow, I'm giving them a bit of obviously Dubai is an artificial city, but I'm giving them as much as I can the opportunity to take risks and to sort of make mistakes and all of those things. And I don't really know what they're getting up to, but I'll have to just trust that that they're being kind to everyone that they encounter, and I think they are. I love that. I love that story. It's so important for our children to have that little bit of privacy for themselves, that we don't need to micromanage their time or know everything about them. But Absolutely. It takes a deep level of trust, though, from trust of them, but trust in ourselves that we're doing the right thing as parents. And so moving to more recent times, when was the last time a child taught you something about yourself that you weren't aware of?
Well, this again wasn't the last time, but it does stand out. I would need to give you some context to it before giving that story. So I worked at this nursery that was deemed outstanding by Ofsted, and was they were quite over the top about safeguarding policies, and they would force children to walk on hard surfaces and run on and permit them to only run on grass. They made children run outdoors in the same direction so they wouldn't bump into each other. The kind of stuff that you were talking about, managing risk for them. Interestingly, the nursery had more accidents than any other place that I ever worked at, because we were managing risks for them rather than allowing them to take risk and assess risk for themselves. So we even had elaborate instructions on the kinds of phrases we could use with children when risk was involved. And for instance, if you found a child doing something that involved physical risk, you were expected to approach a child and say something like, I'm really worried that, you will bump into your friend and hurt yourself. That sort of language was such so ingrained into us educators in that setting. So anyway, fast forward, I carried these habits and practices to the next setting that I went to. And at this nursery, there was this 4-year-old girl who was she just loved pushing boundaries. She just loved doing things that made most adults feel uneasy. It was just how she was, and she was also a very skilled tree climber. She just would go to heights that you wouldn't expect a 4-year-old child to go to. And there was this one time that she kept going up the tree in the garden, and I was standing below and regurgitating these formulaic phrases that I had with her without even realizing that I was doing it. And she just turned around and looked at me and said, "You're always worried, aren't you?"
Brilliant.
That made me pause, and it made me rethink a kind of language that I was using with children, and it enabled me to see the risk-averse language that had become part of my daily vocabulary and practice. But it also got me thinking of better ways of using language that helped children manage risk by themselves and for themselves. So, yeah.
That's brilliant. There's nothing like a 4-year-old really to tell us what's what, that's just, they're brilliant, aren't they? They really are. I love that. And did she manage to get down safely without with your strict instructions?
I realized that I didn't need to instruct her. She was more skilled than most people I know.
It's so funny, isn't it? And when children aren't used to being spoken to in that language of sort of slowly or gently or carefully, it can be really strange to them. And my daughter Olivia said that to me a couple of weeks ago when we were with other friends in a play date, and one of the parents kept on saying careful to her daughter, careful, careful, careful. And Olivia came up and whispered to me, and it's like, why is she saying careful the whole time? Why doesn't she just let her concentrate? And it was like, because they're not, I've tried to really not say that at all to Olivia and Harry and just let them do whatever. And it's so funny how, they notice and they pick up on everything, don't they?
And especially when you're keeping on saying careful, you're actually distracting the child, like you say.
Exactly. That's what Olivia knew. She's like, she can't concentrate if she's saying careful the whole time. So it's really funny, isn't it? It's really funny. Children show us what we need to know, hey? Yeah. And so, Sid, please, for question 6, when was the last time a child caught you out of integrity and questioned you on it?
Well, it was my niece who is in Australia. I think she was 12 when this happened. And so I have video chat with her once in a while, where we have extensive conversations about all kinds of topics. And this one time we were chatting, and I decided to take a screenshot of our images whilst during the conversation. I thought, I don't have many photos of her with me, so I just decided to take a screenshot. And after we chatted and hung up, I shared this screenshot with her, and she responded saying, "Ooh, I like that photo of me, but you didn't have my consent to take a screenshot."
Wow.
So that was, definitely, I'm big on consent, but that moment was a real learning moment for me, things that we take for granted.
And how did you explain yourself? How did the conversation go afterwards?
Well, I did not really see that coming at all. So, and I was really, really proud of her for calling me in on that, to be able to stand up for herself and what she believed. So of course, I mean, the response to her was that, I apologized and ensured that I would respect her wish in the future. But there wasn't any explanation needed, she had
Yeah.
totally owned it.
Yeah. And how powerful for a 12-year-old to just know so clearly, of what her boundaries were and what was okay and what not was okay. Yeah, it's great.
And I
It's
think
really,
that
really
definitely
good.
needs to be part of, the educational experience, to know consent from a very young age. And,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Yeah. I've heard some really interesting lectures about the topic of consent and sex education. Actually, sex education should be about consent and pretty much about nothing else, because we're just taught the nuts and bolts of it, but nothing about consent or pleasure or anything. Because if you talk about pleasure and consent, then you don't need to talk about anything else, because then everything else is taken care of, right? Because if everyone knows that it's meant to be consensual, then all the other things that come afterwards don't need to be unpicked. When I attended that workshop, I was like, wow, it's so true. It's so much simpler than sex education could be, so much simpler than it's made to be. If we just start from a completely different perspective. Yeah, it's really, really, really interesting. Yeah. And so for question 8, this is probably a tricky one. What is your favorite Dr. Montessori quote? If you have one in general, or just today, what is your favorite Dr. Montessori quote?
Well, I do have one written here. Let me get it. Okay, here. I give very few lessons on how to give lessons, lest my suggestions, becoming stereotypes and parodied, should turn into obstacles instead of help. The directress is dealing with different personalities, and it therefore becomes more of a question of how she should orient herself in what is for her a new world, rather than any rigid and absolute rules. So this is from a Montessori quote from E.M. Standing's biography.
Yeah.
And I just think it's just refreshing to read this, especially in the context where there is the tendency to get caught up in the mechanistic implementation of the approach without really grasping the spirit of Montessori practice and philosophy. Recently, we've been reading the Montessori method together with a couple of my friends. And if you read the first few chapters of the Montessori method, you find that Montessori was in fact fighting against this very mechanistic, reductionist approach to quote unquote scientific education at the time, where they had all the techniques and tools and instruments to measure learning and measure sort of development, but lacked a deep sense of knowing that only came through what Montessori refers to as intimate relationship between the educator and the child. So yeah, I mean that quote really is a powerful one for me, and a needed one in the Montessori community.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for bringing that to our attention, because we get so caught up in, and even in the training, there's so much about how, and different training colleges, argue about how we should be presenting a particular piece of work, when we're just losing, as you so beautifully said, the spirit of Montessori, or even the spirit of the child in front of us, if we're just presenting in the same way, like you said, is your introduction, not presenting in the same way. We all do at the beginning when we're scared, right? We present in a very formulaic way, but it's the moving away from the materials of being absolutely everything, and it's the whole, isn't it? The whole experience for the whole experience of the environment we want to be a gift to the child, not just the way we present the pink tower or what have you. Yeah, the whole like a colleague of mine has got a new classroom this year in a new location, and she was and it's a big classroom, and obviously it's the beginning of term, beginning of the academic year, and she's just saying, you know, I hope I'm doing these children justice, and I hope I'm doing this classroom justice, and I just feel like I'm drowning. And I said, look, just your presence in that environment is a gift to the children. Don't hope for anything more than just seeing each child in front of you. Even if you don't present anything, don't worry. Just being with them and accepting them is more powerful. But we all remember what it's like first term of the first academic year with a new classroom. It's hectic. It's really, really hectic. But yeah, and so many in this podcast series have spoken about us moving away from the formulaic approach to the materials and just doing it in that way. So it's really, really good to hear that from so many different Montessorians for slightly different perspectives, you know, for us all to focus on the spirit of Montessori, on the spirit of the child, and what really is the essence of what she was seeking to create through her work. Yeah, yeah, it's lovely. And so, Sid, for question 9, please, what is your deepest desire for Montessori in the future?
So my deepest desire for Montessori in the future is for Montessori to be in a continuous place of reconfiguring, for the Montessori community to be brave enough to read Montessori through contemporary critical theories that challenge some of the very core tenets of Montessori. I am personally drawn to the works of feminist scholar and biologist Donna Haraway, and she has this phrase called staying with the trouble. And that means coming to a place of being able to hold controversies and contradictions together without having to smoothen them out. You know, I think that kind of smoothing not only erases the problematic aspects of Montessori, but it also takes away opportunities to what the feminist decolonial scholar Maria Lagoon calls deep coalition. So I think it is perfectly okay that Montessori is imperfect.
We all are, right?
And that and the approach is imperfect. You know, I think a perfection of a pedagogy is not and should not be something that we, you know, try to keep as our goal. As soon as it becomes a perfect approach, or we think it is perfect, it will stop being pliable, responsive, and lively. And yeah, I think that sort of constant reconfiguring is something that I hope will be the future of Montessori.
Yeah. And so I guess my next question is, do you think we're all brave enough to do it, though? That's the question. to adapt and to, yeah, I love how you put that, reconfigure, to adapt to the changing needs. Even from 2 years ago, the world is so different of what we need and what children need. And, you know, post-COVID, there's more children in poverty than before. There's more women below the poverty line than before, you know, around the world. There's even more inequality than there was before COVID, you know. The global majority are in a worse position. So what can we do in Montessori to really give ourselves a shake, if that's what we need to reconfigure? What do you see that we need to do on a micro level and a macro level as Montessori, you know, collaborators, as it were?
I don't see that happening at an institutional level. I've lost a bit of hope and trust with the institutions to make shifts. I feel a lot of hope from a grassroots level, and how Montessorians are coming together, like the Montessori Everywhere project.
So brilliant.
It's such a great example for how we can come together, collaborate. And what I said earlier about Maria Lagoon's term of deep coalition, so if we want to counter and respond to injustice, that sort of coming together and holding each other is very important, I would say.
Oh, that's lovely. Coming together and holding each other. That's really lovely.
Yeah.
And so what do you see is your role in achieving this, your desire for Montessori, of the reconfiguration? Where do you fit?
In many ways, I see my role as what the scholar Sarah Ahmed refers to as the feminist killjoy.
What a great title. You could be a superhero, the feminist killjoy.
As someone who speaks, uncomfortable and necessary truths, but also as someone who thinks with, stands with and becomes with others. Not as a unitary singular person, but it's always a collective doing with. And I think critique or critically engaging with Montessori is important. It isn't a bad thing. For me, I think critiquing Montessori, I critique Montessori approach because I love Montessori, and it's easy to critique something you hate. So you critique.
So true, yeah.
You critique because you believe something deserves a future, and I believe Montessori deserves the future. And I think critique ensures that Montessori will continue to be a dynamic, vibrant, responsive approach, and not a stagnant method. But yeah, but of course, critique by itself is not enough if it doesn't also entail creation. This feminist scholar, Rosi Braidotti, talks about the marriage between critique and creation, bringing together critique and creation, and how that productive partnership is very important in our activism. So yeah, I think we need also to consider alternative ways of thinking and doing. So the truth is, Western scientific theories and theories of dead white European scholars are
so great. I've heard this expression so much recently, and I just love it so much. We're just listening to dead white men. Like, it's just so funny how it's like, it's so true. Like,
sadly, yeah. It's so coded into the way we think, and live and die in the world, and and other ways of living and dying, as in the words of Donna Haraway, has become unthinkable, unavailable to us to think. So part of what I am doing and interested in is bringing these critical ways of thinking into the realm of Montessori practice, because we can get so stuck in Montessori is the best way, and Montessori is the best practice, that we just can't see outside that narrow lens. And being able to read Montessori through these different critical theories, I think is very important for us to be relevant, but also be attuned to what Montessori was initially all about, and that is, she was, her approach was all about justice and care, about responding to injustice. So we are going to respond to injustice in the 21st century. It is going to look different because the injustices are more complex, but lots of things that weren't made known during her time is now available to us, as a result of digital, networking and
Yeah.
digital technologies.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said earlier, I have recently published a few papers where I utilize some of these theories to open out investigations in Montessori classrooms and to enable thinking and practicing Montessori differently, but most importantly to enable a difference within Montessori practice.
Yeah. And I'd be interested to know how is your work generally received? Because as you said, the balance of critique and creation, how do you find the Montessori community in general receiving the critique, if it is perceived as critique? I mean, I know Barbara Isaacs and you were really, really good friends, and she said to me, oh, I love how Sid always just challenges me to look at things in a different way, but not everyone in the world is as open as Barbara, right? So
no, it is quite a trudge, and sadly, with the George Floyd thing, it's sad that the death of a person being aired through a mobile device kind of got people thinking about, it shocked people to see that and to witness that. But that's not anything new for the Black community.
Yeah.
So I think people are becoming more receptive, but at the same time, there's a huge resistance within the Montessori community, especially people who are trying to conserve and protect Montessori, a particular version of Montessori,
Yes.
And they don't want to hear that, there's issues related to whiteness, issues related to, all sorts of issues, which, we need to address. We can't just be occupied with, oh, Montessori is all perfect and good. We have to talk about the problematic aspects.
Yeah. Definitely.
As I said, Montessori deserves a future.
Yeah, that's lovely. Montessori deserves a future. But I mean, just looking at Montessori has bad press. Even if we just look at Instagram, using the hashtag Montessori is just pages and pages and pages of these perfect shelves in like a cream and beige sitting room, and a perfect child, a perfect white child going to the shelf and taking work and putting everything back and where it belongs and all of this stuff. And it just really bothers me. It really bothers me because to me, that's not, I mean, everything in my home is accessible to the children, but I won't pan the camera around now so you can see the chaos I'm living in. But it's like, it's a home for young children. So it's
exactly.
It's like, I want them to feel cozy, and at home, I don't want it to feel like it's regimented. It shouldn't be like that.
No, and that was Montessori's original idea, the children's house, where the children could
feel like a home.
Be. And I feel when you look back into historical images of Montessori classrooms, and if we were to judge those classrooms by the standards, the manicured sort of standards we have today, it would miserably fail. I mean, that sort of sense of beauty that we've constructed is just doesn't help neither the practitioner or the child. We're just imposing a certain aesthetics to that's for the sake of us, not for the sake of the children.
It's a white middle class aesthetic as well. It's not culturally relevant.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there's an aesthetic that is very, very much shaped by middle class sensibilities, and I mean, if we go to early years, I mean, traditional earlier settings, where things aren't as muted.
Yes.
That kind of shows us the sort of contrast in terms of class sensibility. So.
Yeah, very much so. And I'm going on a bit off topic here, Sid, but I'd love to know how you were involved in the feminist side of things. Was that before Montessori or since Montessori? How did you come into doing work around feminism? Or was that just by chance?
Well, I mean, Initially, it was when I first came into Montessori, I was really troubled by the underrepresentation of men, and the narratives that surrounded the recruitment of men were very problematic. Women and people of color, communities of color were framed in very negative terms as, in deficit. And there was a sort of narrative that men can come in and bring balance, and it's often referred to as a recuperative masculinist politics. That if you have men, you can recuperate early years and help the boys and help the girls, who are underachieving. That sort of narrative, and which automatically frames, women as deficit.
In the deficit, yeah.
At the same time, it also promotes a very heteronormative sort of model, that only if you have a man and a woman together, is a family complete, or is a society complete. And, where there are lots of there's lots of longitudinal studies that have been done that shows queer families are equally as effective and loving and amazing as any other family. So I mean, those kind of issues actually got me thinking about gender and thinking about how gender was being framed. And the first time I read about feminist research was through the works of Glenda McNaughton, who wrote a book called Rethinking Gender in Early Childhood Education. And in that, she uses feminist post-structuralist theory, which considers how language shapes the realities, gendered realities of children. So that was my sort of segue into feminist research and feminist thinking. But yeah, I mean, feminism has always been part of my life, way before that.
And was that from your parents or your upbringing, or how did that come to be? That's so awesome.
Well, my mother was a professor and a dean of the political science department in a university in India, and her experience of being a woman in a male-dominated sort of context, and the sort of misogyny she experienced and the sexism she experienced was really, I heard those stories growing up as a child, and it used to make me really angry. So that feminist rage was very much part of my childhood.
Amazing. So that had a profound effect on you, and isn't that incredible how then it just, on this path, then it's a natural path to go deeper into that with something like Montessori, with early childhood. That's so interesting. Thank you for telling us how that all began. And it's interesting you said about the longitudinal studies about queer families raising children. I was listening to a podcast the other day saying that there's this all different types of families can raise children. There's this myth of the single mother as well, can't raise boys and things like that. And it's it places the woman in deficit. And I have a daughter and a son, so it's always in the back of my mind, this narrative of like, is Harry going to be at deficit for some way because I'm a single mum? And it's so entrenched, that belief. And it's just, and what they were saying in this podcast is it's just actually simply not true. There's so many single parents, and there's not this belief that they're somehow in deficit from being raised by a single mother. It's just not the case.
It's not true. Yeah, it also places a particular model of masculinity on men. Because not all men subscribe to traditional masculine sort of ways of being. And
Yes.
I mean, even when I was in the nursery, there was an expectation that I was the disciplinarian. They would say, "Oh, I'll take you to Mr. Sid," and I'm like, "What the?" It's a very unhelpful and reductive sort of way of looking at things.
For both genders, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
All genders,
yeah. Thank you so much, Sid. Thank you so much for the really thought-provoking answers to the questions. And what I love for you to share with us now, please, could you tell us a bit about the Male Montessorian and Montistory and how our viewers and listeners can get hold of you on that and how they can find you and which platforms? I'd love you to tell us a bit more about those two projects, please.
Absolutely. The Male Montessorian was, I started in 2015 as a response to these problematic narratives around men in early childhood, to have a more complex sort of view of childhood and gender. And you can access it via themalemontessorian.com. And Montessori is a personal passion because I love Montessori history. I just love kind of going back and looking at and researching those images and trying to unpick and trouble contemporary notions of what Montessori was or is. And I think it's a very useful exercise. But there's a Facebook page called Montessori, as well as an Instagram account. So feel free to follow and share.
Great. We'll put all the links for that in the bio for this. That's great. Thank you so much. Sid, thank you so much for joining us today and for answering the 10 questions so interesting and so thought-provoking. And thank you for everyone for watching this full series. And coming soon, hopefully within the next couple of months, we're going to be publishing the Montessori Mission book, where I'm going to have a chapter per episode of the podcast, and we're going to be inviting the cultural richness of each of the guests that I've had on the series to share that within the context of Montessori. So it's a really, really exciting project that I'm working on at the moment, and I can't wait to share that all with you. And Sid, thanks so much for being a part of that. And thank you all for watching to the Montessori Mission. Thank you for watching the Montessori Mission. 10 questions, 10 Montessorians, 10 perspectives from 10 communities. And I think I'm going to have to do a series 2 because I've got lots of ideas for new guests. So in 2022, there's definitely going to be a second series. And so until then, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.